This is part 3 of my Erdology Samhain dimensional doorway type situation talk discussion. One of the primary issues that I'm encountering in doing all this massive research, both in historically as well as recreating the mathematics of Erdology, although there's no way to prove it existed way back when, there is always a, well, where did all this technology come from, where all these buildings and all this stuff come from, and without some kind of an advanced astrophysics type mathematics, it's virtually impossible to do without. And in most cases, it is completely impossible in all aspects, shapes, and forms without some kind of an extremely advanced mathematics. Now, there's some stuff that needs to be addressed. And the things that need to be addressed the strongest are the facts surrounding the name Samhain, Halloween, the pre-conquest 753 of the city of Samhain, Halloween, Rome, and the rebranding of it, re-nicknaming of it by Julius Caesar 700 years later. Well, 750 years later. The rebranding of the city happened just years before the development of Christianity, which points to some very interesting aspects to just about all things. You see, the Trojan War plays a massive and beyond significant role in the development of the city of Rome. The Punic War started immediately upon the end of when the walls of Troy were breached, although the city wasn't called Troy. That's a nickname that the Hyksos / Dorian / Avaris gave the city as a insult. It actually means city of Jews, but its actual name is something different. The Trojan War started at the palace at Knossos at 1330-ish, 1320 BCE, and extended up into and through for the next 3,300 years, and only ended in just off of Bellingham Bay, or off the Nooksack, which dumps into in Bellingham Bay, and Whatcom County, and what would become Bellingham, Washington state. Well, at that point it was territory, or it was just before it became a territory. The Trojan War lasted for 3,300 years because the Trojans kept moving out, kept evacuating, and the enemy kept following them. Now, what does this have to do with Erdology? Well, Erdology is the science that the Trojans and the Jews and such had possessed, used, and achieved phenomenal goals with. The Isius descendants, being the Hyksos and the Dorian and the Avaris and the Romans and such, the Anglo-Saxons, the goal that Isius line had, depending on what time period and what generation, is to find all aspects of this technology, Erdology, Eardology. AERD is Old High German for Earth. It's also the foundational structure to, with, and through the Futhark is made of 3/8, AETT. So you have the AE from the three portions of the Futhark. For lack of a better concept, the three seasons of a day: night, morning, afternoon. The three seasons applied to the day. The day applied to the year: winter, spring, summer, winter. The difficult aspect of this Samhain situation is that the Trojan War began at the Palace of Knossos with Theseus doing some stuff, and it was a battle over the Minotaur and the weapons that allowed King Knossos, King Minos, although that's not his actual name. That was a king of that city much later, like by centuries, or earlier by centuries. King Minos was a Hyksos. Hatred of Jews, hatred of anything that would not make him more powerful, hated education unless it produced weapons. And he used his weapons to force the cities within the reach of that weapon to send him tributes, and one of those tributes became Theseus. Theseus volunteered, went into the catacomb, which has a very, very long, very complicated story. The labyrinth was not in the Palace of Knossos. It was a ship that was stranded after the Thera volcano erupted hundreds of years before. The Thera volcano took a 1,000-foot long ship and parked it right in front of the Palace of Knossos. That ship would be identical to the two Lake Nemi ships and the Noah's Ark, which became renamed to the Vatican, theoretically speaking. And the Hyksos wanted those weapons and would stop at nothing to obtain them. So when Theseus defeated Agamemnon, a secondary nothing, he was going to conquer the Palace of Knossos, and Theseus beat him to it, took the slaves and the like out of the area, out of Palace of Knossos, and used the new weapons and the new army to go to whatever the city of Poseidon, conquer it, and rename it to honor his mother and his grandfather's deity, which would be the Aten, Aten. Now, this is linear A we're speaking of, since linear B would not be invented yet. So you have to have between linear B, linear C, and Proto-Greek, you have to add the H after the T and make it a personal possessive. You have to add an apostrophe S. Well, later on you have to take off the apostrophe and just make it Athens. But the root of Athens is the Aten. So the Trojan War started at Knossos, went to Athens, then went to Troy, and then left Troy and went to the city of Samhain, where were the descendants of Agamemnon and the descendants of the Trojans battled it out for the next 600 years until the Trojans evacuated it and left to go to Northumberland, although it wasn't called Northumberland. Northumberland is the English terminology for the Gaelic YR hen Ogle DD, the Ogle family. The Ogle family would play a significant role in the Samhain War, otherwise known as the 7 Years' War, otherwise known as the French and Indian War. The Ogles were the Indians, not because they were native, but because it was an insult regarding the Indian, Tiberius, the Indus River, the Nile, because it meant the area that the Nile flooded, the west side of the Nile between Saqqara and Giza, which is where the pyramids were located. It's also where Narmer selected at 3200 BC the Jews to have their own reservation / concentration camp, for lack of a better. And they owned and controlled that area, give or take control, depending on who was alive at what decade, or what pharaoh was okay with the Jews and what pharaoh was anti-Semitic. The word Indian is a play on that concept. The observance of the Great River, and not only the observance of the Great River, but all the things the Great River is connected to, is in communication with, is a symbolic reference to. One of those symbolic references to the Great River is, of course, the weave, the flow of the weave that is created by the loom on the platform that is created by the Tabernacle of Adam system, that is 4 Kaaba surrounding 4 trees that are cordoned off between the 4 rivers of creation, the Gihon, the Pion, the Tigris, and Euphrates. Each Kaaba helps support a tree, keep it healthy and warm in the winter, and it's a tent, so they just pull it back and let the tree do what it needs to do in the summer. The good news, the good aspect of this situation is that as the sequence and as the parameters of how do you say this? As the sequence and parameters of the Trojan War danced, there's a sequential amount of information that is the enemy goes and hunts and destroys a library or kills a population, and their descendants go off someplace else, rebuild the civilization, rebuild Israel, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild libraries, and then the enemy follows and destroys them in the exact same sequence, in the exact same way. So there's a statistical map on how to, if you perform the same action over and over again and without changing results, then you know then those actions are reversible, and you can know what the previous cultures had based off of modern history's recreation and retelling of, as historically as accurate as historical accuracy as possible, how the Erdology was removed from Western culture knowledge. Now, one of the ways that Erdology was removed from Western culture knowledge was by burning libraries and killing people. But one of the things they could not do was hide the secrets. The secrets are too complicated to be able to find their hiding place and destroy them. And even the few and far between times that actually did occur, there's 1,000 cultures that have been destroyed, and each one of them left clues behind. Well, each one of those cultures that left clues behind left clues differently. So therefore, it's impossible to find all the clues, all the secrets that were left behind by the culture that it was destroyed, cultures that were destroyed, and to find them and destroy the secrets they left behind. So it's possible to, if you know what you're looking for, to look for different aspects of clues and then rebuild the information based off of how this culture specifically hid its information. All in all, very, very bloody complicated. But not only is it complicated, but there's also another aspect that is difficult. Yes, the Nazis spent 24 years in Rome, specifically at Lake Nemi, working very, very hard to recreate the Noah's fleet at Lake Nemi, at least those two ships, disassembled them, shipped them to Berlin or Nuremberg, and reassembled them, and we're going to make a dozen or 2 dozen 1,000-foot long, almost 1,000-foot long ships out of the knowledge that they had gained, and therefore recreating Noah's fleet, because there's power in Noah's fleet. The civilization began in Egypt when Noah found Mount Ararat. That's a fixed point location that he knew where he was, so he can then navigate to where the temple of IWNW was, based off of knowing where Mount Ararat was. So he went to Mount Ararat, turned his fleet, and then sailed directly to the city of IWNW, and then parked. And then those ships became the basis of the Egyptian civilization that flourished for the next 4,000 years, only being destroyed by the Romans, but the civilization was still flourished. It just didn't have the same level of technology that they had previously. Now, one of the primary problems that comes up now in this given situation is the fact that not only is the how do I put this? Not only is the entire structure of the Noah's Ark thing about building civilization, which is what the Third Reich really wanted to do. They wanted to rebuild all of mankind based off of the Aryan model, which in the Aryan model is very, very loosely interpreted to be the Nephilum model, although and genetically correct, but philosophically, whoa, doggy, they're not even close species. Now, one of the problems that Adolf had was that, one, he was a puppet, so he was only given limited information from the Prussian Empire. But two, yes, there is a huge difference between the Jews and the Hebrews. The Hebrews are from Moses, created by Moses. All of the language, the ceremonies, and the philosophy is a modification off of ECU's teachings through Moses. Now, the Jews, on the other hand, are an entirely different culture in all aspects. Minus a very, very long time ago, they were brothers. So the genetics back then were familial. 2,000-3,000 years later, they were not that close. As culturally, they had separated out into a base aspect of who they were and what they were doing. As mentioned, Barbara Bush's mother, Paula, worked very closely with Aleister Crowley of the OTO, which was an organization that was most likely created by the Prussian Empire. The OTO being a renamed version of the Free Corps in wherever the one or two cities that the OTO claimed that their origins were. That was the OTO was simply renamed for the Free Corps, which is this paramilitary spy organization from the Prussian Empire, which has very strong and violent connections with Mecca, the Blue Horde, and with Muhammad, and going directly back to Siu, the Hyksos, the Dorians, the Avaris, and so on. One of the things that they need to do is work with and perform ceremonies that involve intimacy. The problem with this is that those ceremonies are both needed and by the general public are hated with a passion. The Puritans have a very strange and in most cases a very deviant way to look at sex and intimacy, forcing others to obey and abide by rules that they don't even really pay attention to either, which is, according to the argument between God and Satan wanted man to worship God in very specific ways, and God disagreed. God stating in no uncertain terms that free will was how man was going to worship him. The expressions of how man did free will was what God wanted as the way to be worshipped, and Satan disagreed. So Satan kept pushing to have man worship him and worship God in a very specific way, and hence the battle that followed. Puritans demand, and in most cases violently follow up on, forcing people to live their life, forcing outside people and groups and cultures to follow rules that they set out, because the violent reprisals that the Puritans give most of the time are worse than are very, very bad. They're very violent. They're almost terroristic in nature. Now, just because the Puritans stopped calling themselves Puritans does not mean that they stopped being Puritans, or they stopped following the same basic concepts and rules that the Puritans of Massachusetts, Plymouth colony, did not follow. They name changed to a variety of things, including the Great Awakening movements and born again Christian and these kind of things. Conservative, uber conservative, and so on. Just because they name changed does not mean that their behavior patterns have changed at all. In fact, their behavior patterns in some ways have gotten worse. A lot worse. One of the problems that this has ensued is that anyone who interacts with a Puritan culture, specifically in academics, has to run that gauntlet of Puritan values before they can actually pursue knowledge and education. A lot of the professors are, even though some of the professors are liberal, they still have an underpinning of Puritan values, and the school board is mostly Puritan. Whether they admit it or not is a different question. But they still stay to to that hard line, almost terroristic aspects to what is acceptable to research and what is not acceptable to research. Noah's fleet is an interesting thing to talk about. Noah's fleet being found in and around the city of Heliopolis and then carted up and transported to Rome 2,000 years ago by Caligula. One of the ships made into the Vatican, two of the ships made into the Lake Nemi Ships, and I'm guessing other ships were made into other things and other buildings and such. Specifically what those were and where they ended up is an excessively good question to follow up on. For evidence, a continuity of evidence regarding this, you need not look no further than the story of Noah told in the Great Flood, of course, told using the Pyramid of Khufu, Cheops, as an example of the fleet, the Noah's fleet. You also have to look no further than the Narmer monolith in very southern Egypt, fairly close to Herculopolis, Heirakonolops. That monolith is a description of Noah's Ark. And being a description of Noah's Ark indicates rather strongly that there was a fleet there and that it was edited down to one boat, the same as the 4 trees were edited down to 1 tree. Why it was needed to edit that by the Hyksos, the Avaris, the Dorians, specifically Moses, why Moses needed to edit that down and remove free will from humans to be able to make their own decisions about the subject, and then making it a capital crime to question the authority of Moses. He killed more than a few that who knew the previous stories, and if they knew the previous stories and questioned his authority, he'd kill them. He had 40 years to do nothing but execute anyone, genocided anyone who questioned his authority as he was writing the 5 books of Moses. Where he went and what he did during those 40 years is highly in debate, because there's very little evidence that they went to the areas that they actually went. More likely, he took his Jewish slave shield wall, went to Troy, and decimated a large portion of his army there, and then followed the evacuating Trojans to Rome, although it wouldn't be called Rome for 600 years, to the city of Samhain, and continued fighting there, and took his meager, the ones that survived that 20 years worth of battle, and came back to the Levant lands, where he was by this time a 60-year-old man, and had spent 30 years in solid and complete combat, which means that his body was riddled with battle injuries. So he did not make it. He did not arrive back. He did not arrive back in Levant lands alive. He died before arriving back home, although he'd never been there. There's all kinds of stuff that goes along with that. The point being, the fleet. Hitler wanted that fleet. And he reflected that fleet in several aspects of what he did. He wanted Noah's fleet. And since the Vatican and those two boats are physical representations of that came from Heliopolis, and Heliopolis and IWNW are the same place, and they're directly connected to both Adam and Noah, there is no middle ground as to the function and the structure to and or through which there's fleets involved, plus the fact the Narmer situation and Hitler claiming to be the Pharaoh of Egypt while he was there, even though it was internal only, and the rest of the world said, no, thank you, no, this is not true. Well, yes, he owned all of Egypt. He was the commander, so therefore, but actually his commander and his commanding officers and the Prussian Empire, they would be the Pharaoh of Egypt. But to acknowledge that they were actually the Pharaoh is a difficult thing, because then they would have to actually come out of the closet and acknowledge the fact that Adolf was simply a puppet to their puppet master, and that they were in charge, and the Holocaust was their orders, and they were the ones that ordered the massive decimation of the troops, the German troops in Russia, and that Nazi machine guns killed as many Russians as they did Nazis. So, and same on the other side. Stalin's forces were, if you retreat without orders to retreat, will kill you. So the Russian troops killed as many Russian troops that were. You either charge that machine gun nest and are killed in the process, or if you retreat, we'll kill you with our machine gun. So it became, who are you going to be killed by, the enemy or your commanding officers? When you're dealing with a fleet, you don't need that many men. You don't need a huge mobile army. You need skilled sailors. The skilled sailors, of course, would be part of the wolf pack, which would be another part of Hitler's Noah's fleet situation. He used the wolf pack, the U-boats, the submarines, as a major aspect of his military. And he moved more troops and supplies underwater as he did on top of the water. It's easy to bomb ships on the water. It's difficult to find submarines. So as they were succeeding in doing the necessary jobs, the Third Reich, were doing the necessary jobs of reassembling Noah's fleet in first Nuremberg to be able to recreate that, and then test it in Nuremberg, and then have a grand, huge palace, and, for lack of a better word, circus in Berlin. They wanted to test it out in Nuremberg first, and then move it to Berlin, to have a half-mile long circus where they and changing horses for boats, for ships, and instead of having horse races, have ship races, and be able to use the same facilities to sail his recreated Noah's Ark fleet in a big oval, big track circle, and be able to please the 300,000, 500,000 people in the grandstands, be able to do grand rallies where he could put and on some kind of a multimedia campaign out in the fields outside, he could have a couple million people present while they watched the Grand Commander stand on the observation on the platform over the fountain next to a recreation of the weaving machine, the loom that Adam would use to create the weave of time. And then having various sort of his other staff members on that ship, and the secondary staff members on the ship behind, and other staff members on either other ships behind that, or equally big ships behind that. Have one ship that's 50, 60 feet wide, that's 900 feet long, and then several feet between, and then you have another ship that's just that's about a dozen feet shorter behind that, and then have smaller boats behind that, or another equally large ship behind that, smaller boats, and then have another equally large ship behind that, so that when they were doing this grand Noah's fleet like parade, they would be recreating humans from the Aryan model, repeating exactly what Noah did after the flood. It's after the flood, Noah repopulated the world with his people. The problem is what he didn't understand is that yes, his people were there, but at the same time, it's also mentioned 3 or 4 times previous, during, the middle, and post the Nephilim. In fact, the Nephilim are the first 4 paragraphs of the chapter that ends with Noah. They're mentioned 3 times in the next chapter, and they're mentioned in the chapter after that. So there's lots and lots of mentions of the Nephilim and the Noah's fleet. Now, the Nephilim had the knowledge and the experience to be able to build ships that big. A raft or a simple canoe or a small 20-30 foot ship was the best that the people of that time period could assemble. The Nephilim were into 1,000-foot long aircraft carriers. 2,000-foot aircraft carriers, no problem. Aircraft, what is that? This is a foreign concept this would be a foreign concept for the next 2,500 years until a model of a plane or some kind of a bird type thing was found in one of the mastaba. That was 1,700 years later. You can put the entire Roman Empire in that hole. You can put many civilizations in the hole between A and B. There's a lot going on here, but the Nephilim had those skills. Now, it would be interesting if Hitler assumed that the Aryans were just a German version of the Sumerian word Nephilim. That would be an interesting concept, although there is no real way to tangibly prove that in any significant way, shape, or form. The only way to significantly examine that would be to dig deep into various assorted books and various neo-Nazi groups and ask them questions, hoping that they will be honest with you and to tell you what's going on. Now, the other thing is that the Lake Nemi Ships were the the reason why Adolf put so much effort and energy and money and power and time and resources and thousands of troops and thousands of scientists and workers and the whole nine into interviewing the entire population around Lake Nemi to find out as much information about the ships as possible, and then built that huge museum, which was not actually a museum, and then dismantled the ships, shipped them to Nuremberg to be reassembled. What happened to those ships after Nuremberg is an extremely good question. Whether they arrived in Nuremberg is most likely a yes. Were they partially reassembled? Partially, yes. But are they in some kind of a deep mine someplace? Have they been hidden someplace, away from anything and everything in some deep crevice somewhere? Were they dismantled and hidden someplace? Of course, that's a mountain of wood and rock to hide someplace, but it's possible. There's things that are still being found to this day. That there's bombs that are being found to this day that were dropped 50, 60 years ago. Now they may have been put, although it's kind of difficult to put planking that big onto U-boats because the U-boats were not that big, and put the planking onto U-boats, and because the Amber Room was shipped via the Amber Room was captured in the first days of Operation Barbarossa. Barbarossa was launched six weeks after Rudolf Hess defected to Northumberland, which is like 50 miles away from Ogle Castle. And Bamberg Castle is in the middle of Northumberland, which means that where Hess was aiming at was at the stronghold of the Ogle family. Why he was aiming at the stronghold of the Ogle family in the British Empire, not the English Empire. The English Empire and the British Empire are two entirely separate species. Things are complicated. Alan Turing and MK Ultra, one of the reasons why his original Christopher is 1,000-fold more complicated than the recreation Christopher is because Hess and Himmler and the members of the Fool Society, who name changed to the Fourth Reich, what they did was they sent internally coded messages inside the communication inside the battlefield communication. So the Phil Society did not want the English to find out about those coded communications. So the Phil Society and the British were in communication, but the Third Reich and the Prussians and the English and also the Americans were totally ignorant of the hidden, massively encrypted hidden layers of communication between the Phil Society and the British. Now, one of the reasons why that would be in place, and by the way, that's easy to prove. One of the reasons why that would be in place is because Noah's fleet, that Hitler was so lustful about recreating Noah's fleet. And it follows perfectly with the whole Aryan concept. So that whole Aryan concept is perfectly aspect of let's destroy humanity, let's destroy humans, and then rebuild the Aryans from select solid Aryan stock and repopulate, and then brings up the whole Lebensborn project and a couple of others, which is all about sex and weirdness and such. But that we'll cover that later. Cover that in a different part. The fleet has a undefinable and unmistakable aspect to Halloween, Samhain, and having vehicles, having devices, having ships that can travel from A, this dimension, to B, some other dimension, a different time, a different place, a different plane, between earth and heaven, earth and hell, what have you. Whatever you look at as to dimension travel, Hitler was very interested in that, because that is, by legend and by rumor, what the definition of Samhain actually is. It's a city that has 1 foot in the mortal plane and 1 foot in the astral, or the ethereal, the eternal, 1 foot in heaven, 1 foot in earth. It is very similar to the definition of Mount Olympus, which on archaeological digs on Mount Olympus has revealed no architecture whatsoever. That is not true for the 7 hills of Rome. Now, whether or not 7 is spelled S-E-V-E-N or it is spelled S-A-M-H-A-I-N, that is an excessively good question. What is not in question at this specific section in time, in this research, what has been statistically proven and theory-wise proven, mostly beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that Hitler had a major passion, psychotic passion, for the occult, which is obvious, and experimental weapons. And he poured mass amounts he poured equal amounts of money and resources into the Lake Nemi Ships as he did the V1 project, as he did into Messerschmitt, as he did into the Nazi Bell, as he did into various assorted other projects. Now, the second the Allies won, the Nazi Bell became instantaneously classified. The grand architectural plans that Adolf was working on, including the Nuremberg parade grounds and the 1,000 other buildings that he had started to design, and he has started to build around Nuremberg. A lot of them are still in existence. The parade grounds were left in place. You can still stand where Adolf stood in 1930, and the grandstands and the field is, other than age, wear and tear of almost a century, it's still almost exactly the same as it was then. Behind that is where the hypothetical fleet was going to be rebuilt. Now, the building, its foundations are still there. Its partial construction is still there. But this answers why the architects have been and military engineers have been trying to figure out since they first saw the place and went, why would you want something so bloody big? I mean, this building is several thousand feet long, and is 200-300 feet tall, and has some kind of an indoor moat connected to an outdoor lagoon, which is connected to the river. We don't understand. This makes no sense whatsoever. Well, it makes absolutely perfect sense if you're trying to if you've moved the Lake Nemi ships from Lake Nemi to Nuremberg. It makes even more sense if the Lake Nemi ships were actually from Heliopolis, which would connect them directly to Noah, which means that some aspect of the work of those ships, the hewing of the wood, was done by either Noah or or a member of his family, which changes the argument completely, thoroughly, and entirely in all aspects of. There's some military experts of World War II that the information that I'm presenting, despite having massive amount of evidence to it, is something they've never heard of. Something has never even, this stuff would never even be a guess regarding anything to do with anything that they would know anything about. Which means that the evidence that I came up with about 2 years ago regarding some kind of a Nazi time war using the bell or dozens and dozens of bells to fight some kind of a time war has more and more and more credence to it, has more and more evidence, physical, tangible evidence, with the Lake Nemi ships and with Rome and with the Amber Room being seized and then disappearing from history, although it didn't actually disappear from history. It was just captured by Eric Koch of Koch family fame of Kansas and Texas. More conservative people, a more conservative family is difficult to find and not actually be card-carrying Nazis. In fact, they put money into the Nazi Party. They put money into the John Birch Society, which you find a more conservative group you're not going to be able to find. They put massive amount of money in time and effort into the Confederacy movement, and the Confederacy movement bore the child of the Confederacy would be the Nazi Party. That's because the two they had the same parent. The Free Corps, its parent is the Prussian Empire, and the Koch family are Prussians. So is the Trump family. Name changed. They changed the D. They dropped the D and made it a T. So is Adolf's family. They were members of he was a member of the Free Corps as well. So they're all Prussians. The good thing about being Prussians is that we understand their behavior patterns culturally. The bad part is that the crimes against humanity they commit is difficult to forgive, especially since every new generation tries to do the same thing. So Eric Koch was as a senior member of the Prussian military. He was the mayor of the capital of Prussia. Before there's a issue with Königsberg and Berlin, and the capital, the public capital, the private capital, and who was actually in charge. Well, he was, technically speaking, the capital of Prussia moved to Berlin in 1801, but the private capital remained Königsberg, and it was designed to be a distraction to make sure that the true power base in Königsberg would not have its authority questioned. Königsberg is also where for lack of a better concept, where Noah's fleet was placed. That would be the submarines. That would be the U-boats. Eric Koch was in charge of the U-boats. Almost all of them were either built at and or stationed at Königsberg. Several of them were big enough to place the Amber Room in their cargo holds, and then ship them underwater, of course. Ship them out the Baltic, down the Atlantic, between Florida and Cuba, closer to Cuba than Florida, and then up to the Mississippi no, sorry, up to the Arkansas River, and then as far up the Arkansas River as possible to offload them at a Koch family dock, where the contents would then be shipped to a Koch family, the Koch family compound in, I think, Garden City, or one of the compounds in Kansas, which is that city is located on the close to the southern border, which is which is almost throw a stone and you're going to hit Oklahoma south. That's where the Amber Room is in Kansas. The Koch family took possession of it during Operation Barbarossa and have not relinquished it, and have no interest in telling anybody that they have the Amber Room. They've had the Amber Room since 1942. It's not advantageous to them at all to tell anybody about that. Where the Lake Nemi Ships went, that is a different question, and just as interesting, because there were large ships that were capable of taking the supplies of the Lake Nemi ships into their cargo hold and then shipping them across the Atlantic in 45, of course, after the war was over, as a military exercise, and shipping them to America somewhere. Or they may still be in Germany, they may be in Prussia, they may be in Russia, they may be in America. That is an excessively good question to start asking and start doing their archaeology to do. Now, what are the chances that the Nazis did not lie? By the way, what did they not lie about? That is an extremely small percentage of things that they did not lie about. So they built recreations of the Lake Nemi ships at the Lake Nemi Museum, and to make sure that no professional archaeologist could know Indiana Jones, for lack of a better concept, even though he's fiction, could determine the fact that the ships were fake. They burnt the building. So burning the building and burning the ships to make sure that the illusion that they were the real thing would be lost to time and space. Well, that is 1000% up what the Nazis have done post World War II, had done as they were called the Freikorps, did for 800 years when they were called the Prussian Empire, did for the 100 years when they were called the Teutonic Knights, did whatever they were called beforehand. This is what they do. They take weapons and lie about them to make sure that they have the power and no one else can question their authority. This is what they do. This is how psychology was founded. They pulled Wundt from Heidelberg, Prussia, to Heidelberg University, Tiffin, Ohio, put him in a room and said, "Here, translate this stuff. We're going to give you a helper. Here's Oliver Cowdery. The two of you start working. Oh, it's Joseph Smith. Okay, we're going to locate Joseph Smith. And we're going to kidnap him. We're going to kill his body double / bodyguard, and we're going to make a deal with Brigham Young that Brigham Young tells story X when the truth is Y, and we're going to bring Smith to Tiffin, Ohio, and we're going to put him in the same room as the two of them, and the three of them are going to translate all the Ogle family books." The reason why the Ogle family books were captured is a very long, very complicated, 100-year-long story just in Tiffin, Ohio itself, and directly connected to all kinds of battles and such that occurred in Europe in the previous centuries. The psychology is also directly connected to and through the Salem witch trials and the Leicester's rebellion in Germany that took place at the same time in virtually the same exact area that the Salem witch trials took place. interesting that there's also a major element of sex and intimacy and a tabernacle of Adam system in Salem and in Massachusetts, Boston, and New York. Abigail Adams. Abigail was 8 years old when the affair with John Proctor started. John Proctor was 50, and she was 8. 3 years later, when it finally came to trial, she was 11, almost 12. The trial ended when she was 12 when the trial ended. Ended. This isn't started. This is ended. John Proctor was hanged for having sex with a 12-year-old, having sex with a 9-year-old. Well, duh. Of course, he needed to be hung for having an affair with a prepubescent child. But what were the Puritans trying to achieve with allowing all that sex to be happening under their nose in that community? What were they trying to recreate? Some kind of were they trying to recreate the same war that occurred in 640 with Fatimah and the other dozen armies, the British, the French, although they weren't called French then, they were still the Merovingians, the Germans, the Italians, the Romans, the Northern African armies, the Muslim armies, the Spanish. Every army that had any say-so whatsoever arrived in Rome to battle it out, and that's when the Lake Nemi ships were initially destroyed, at least down to about 10 feet below water level. They've been just fine and dandy for the previous 600 years. If they knew that those ships were connected to Noah's Ark, to Noah's fleet, then they would have known some kind of a electromagnetic machine was involved. They would have known that it would be the Nephilum's library was on board. They would have known that there's some kind of a dimensional situation going on because there's a connection between Noah's fleet and the Tower of Babel and the weapons involved. The Tower of Babel is actually quite bad, very edited story. The tower, the ziggurat, was built as a beacon of knowledge and wisdom. The enemy, Terah, his youngest son Noah, Abraham, his older sons were just as nasty as him. So he formed an army from Ur and attacked the ziggurat of Eridu and conquered it and seized the weapons. They were tools, not weapons, but he seized the tools and turned them into weapons and consequently lobotomized himself. The amber room was reportedly 60 tons of amber with gold inlay. What happens when you compress amber? It releases electricity. Just the thermodynamics of the day, hot to cold, the sun hits the east wall, and the east wall will expand when it gets hot. That will compress the middle. As the middle compresses, it will release electricity. Well, that's what the gold is there for, to direct electricity to a safe location, usually to a machine. As the sun reaches its zenith at high noon, the entire structure is expanded and it is compressing onto the base. As the sun sets, the west side has now expanded all the way, and the south side is starting to contract, and so therefore it's compressing. The northeast side is now compressing to to get back down to being small, and that compression is really so the amber room releases electricity all day long. How is the weapon powered? The weapon is powered by the amber room. The Baroque amber room that was built by the Prussians and was given to the Russians several decades later. The Prussians took it back and then shipped it to America. That's not the first time that technology was developed. In fact, the reason why the Prussians were so pissed off in 1705 is because the Germans and the British had already taken the amber room out, the real amber room, at least one copy of the real amber room, out of Germany, and they shipped it to America for safekeeping. One of the places that they put one of them would be Salem, to get it out of the way. The problem is that when they shipped it there, decades previous, they didn't expect Salem to fall to Puritans, who then settled/invaded and seized control over it, and then wanted to do the same thing. They wanted to seize control over the tool, to dominate the people in the local area, to force them to follow Puritan rules of order and religious dogma, which is not what the tool is designed to do. It's designed to be a tool and not a weapon. And their actions are as self-described. Satan wanted to remove free will and force man to worship God in a certain way. And God said, no, free will is how I want to be worshipped. And Satan disagreed and kept pushing, and the ensuing war started. The ensuing war being excessively important because as the ensuing war progressed, the ones that were against God became fallen. The same basic fate follows the humans that follow the same basic pattern of Satan. They fall, and they fall from grace, and they fall away from the will of God, and have all kinds of problems afterward. The fleet that the Third Reich was interested in and after has a direct connection to dimensions. How much of that connection and contact were the Nazis aware of from Salem is an unknown. Salem has been well documented, but whether or not how much information regarding the tabernacle system of Adam, the amber room, and the associated technologies, as well as the rituals that were associated with intimacies, how much of that is documented, or how much of that did the court understand and be able to write down correctly, that is also an unknown. But going forward, it is difficult to determine where the information came from and the continuity of the information. There's the amount of information I'm leaving out of what led the Third Reich to assume about Noah's fleet. There's the whole Tiffin thing and the formulation of psychology thing. Because there's a huge amount of psychology that is also about the quantum field. And Wundt himself was an expert in electromagnetics, and he had hand-built more than a few electrical machines to measure the human nervous system, as well as the human brain, because the human brain generates electricity. These are all very important things that leads to the concepts and the knowledge that are important to convince the Prussians to let Adolf play and recreate Noah's fleet and recreate some kind of a time machine and time machine war machines. how much of that information came from Tiffin? How much of that information came from the Salem witch trials? How much of it came from the battles, the Roman battles? How much of it came, and the crucifixion, the first emperors after the crucifixion? How much of it came from them, and what are the statistical continuity variables from the Nativity and the crucifixion and the Lake Nemi Ships and the 640 battle and the Age of the Viking and the Dark Ages, Salem witch trials, the battle over the Heidelberg Library at Heidelberg University, Tiffin, Ohio, the creation of psychology in that same thing, the whole Confederacy leading to the loss of the Confederacy, leading to a lot of the Confederates evacuating out of America to go to Prussia, and then the Franco-Prussian War, leading to the think tanks that would eventually form the Third Reich, because those think tanks were sponsored by and supported by the Free Corps, because they were the Free Corps. They were just a different name for the Free Corps itself, branched out into 1,000 different names. There's a lot going on, and all of it revolves around the need for advanced dimensional mathematics, advanced dimensional machines that could travel between dimensions. Ordology is one of the 9 aspects of Ordology is dimension travel. Samhain is dimension travel.